Yesterday we had very interesting panelists from Research ICT Africa. We discussed regulating AI, and it was very interesting that the discussion led to cross-border data flows. I told them, we're going to have that discussion today, and it just felt like a coincidence, because you can't regulate AI without data localization. You have to think about how, or we have to think about how, we go about owning our data, and to ensure that our data isn't used, sort of against us. And then we spoke about protectionism, and I think I wasn't very satisfied with where we landed in terms of the global politics around data sovereignty. And I don't know if, who should I start with? I'm not sure, it's Smriti?
Smriti, yeah, Smriti.
Did I get it right?
That's
yes.
perfect, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, I think we will both touch upon those issues, but Anupam is like the bigger expert, so I think it would make sense.
Okay, you want to give him the mic, okay.
And then I can jump in.
All right.
Fascinating question about how to control your data and how to have power over your artificial intelligence. I think those are really critical questions. And I think all countries across the world are trying to manage these questions. The United States is looking at TikTok and saying, hey, TikTok, you have to move your data to Texas, and we're only safe if you move your data to to there. Yeah, the United States has said that, which is kind of unexpected in some sense. Of course, we're asserting national security rationales for that, and not some kind of economic development rationale. And if I hear you right, Tabore, you're trying to promote how do we use indigenous resources for indigenous development? I think that's the key question. I think that developing countries are asking. How can we avoid simply being exploited for our resources, and recapitulate the colonialism of the centuries long past. So those are critical questions, and I think there are different views on that issue. In terms of whether or not having data local be stored locally is the essential question. I haven't been convinced of that, but these are like Tabore, critical questions, as you say. For example, one question is, are you talking about storage in Africa, or are you talking about storage in each African country? There's some 50 odd countries in Africa. It would be very expensive to run a Pan-African company, a company that hopes to serve the African Union, and localize data in all those countries. That would just be really very, very costly. Now, of course, if the African Union itself can have free flow within the Union, that can reduce the costs of that, right? So I think that has got to be at least a start, for me, a kind of starting point for thinking about these. At least within the Union, you want the data to flow. That's what the European Union did. The European Union has said, we want to ensure that data flows within the Union. And so, it's been, at least those kind of questions are going to be critical, and we can talk about them more, but I just wanted to open up the discussion to discuss this. I do think that the question of governance, making sure that where the data is held, it's governed under local law. I've always been a fan of that. Now, of course, I want to make sure that that governance is constrained by human rights law, but otherwise, I do think it's important that there is data sovereignty in that sense. You control the data wherever it sits. That's my general kind of approach. So I'll pass it along there.
Yeah, thanks, Anupam. Yeah, just to add to that, on the first point, I do think that there is this blurring of lines between the objectives of localization, or call it data sovereignty more broadly, is that sometimes people will use an economic justification, as we see the developing world doing. Certainly in India, we see a lot of arguments around, we want localization because we want the domestic AI industry to flourish. We want to create job opportunity. We want to create infrastructure. And you hear those kind of economic arguments because this will all lead to development. And on the other hand, you see jurisdictions like the US do, the example Anupam gave about TikTok, using security as a justification. But at the end of the day, I do think even though the word is security, there is an underlying, economic rationale to that. The fact that there has been this very clear relationship between the US government and it protecting the interests of big US business, and therefore taking localization so seriously, across jurisdiction and trying to promote free flow of data, and TikTok being a threat economically to those businesses. I don't think, that is a thing you can really divorce. Like, it's not a stated objective, but I think there is clearly that underlying factor which is contributing to, policy making.
So, and Anupam, you spoke about having a framework, a continental framework that would make the sort of localization of data more feasible. Is that the only way, basically? Is that so? A foreign policy approach, completely, trying to get the whole of Africa to agree. Is that the only way you think we can have?
Yeah, I don't think country by country makes sense. It's, so you can imagine a country like India, which is massive, which is literally the more population than the entire continent of Africa, saying, okay, we've got a continent-wide country, we've got a country the size of a continent, we can localize. China did this, of course, to some extent in a different way. But again, we're talking about, we're a 1 billion person population, and Nigeria is very large, South Africa is very large, Egypt is very large, but none of them are, you would want businesses to be able to offer services across borders, because trade generally is empowering. It's empowering for the companies that buy the service or the good, and it's empowering for the companies that sell the services. So remember that if you open up, you're not only you're expanding markets, and you're of course opening up to foreign competition, which is what scares domestic producers. But it also gives opportunities for domestic consumers, which could be businesses or corporations, now to get services and goods from elsewhere. That gives them access to, so imagine a fintech provider based in one country, if it had to localize and all the African states, that would be a frightfully expensive endeavor. And it would actually increase cyber insecurity. It would increase the attack surface that you have, the various entry points. You'd have to make sure that you have 50 data centers that are secure, not just one. And you're relying upon lots and lots of third parties, because you're not going to be yourself building out data centers everywhere. So I do think that the European Union recognized this. They recognized 1995 with the Data Protection Directive. which is very much about getting that data to flow. The Data Protection Directive is literally called, the full name of the Data Protection Directive of 1985 is, it ends with "for the free movement of data." Okay, that was a central pillar of the Data Protection Directive. So it's literally in the title of the directive. So, so I do think that, and so the idea of a digital single market, which the European Union's accepted, is a very attractive one for the African Union, and is something that the African Union should be, African states should hopefully be pushing for. And I would love to see as a kind of local empowerment process. Yeah. I can talk forever, so I have to stop myself.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So.
Sorry, Chandler, let me just quickly, step in. Every time we're very quick to talk about AI and all the whole conversations and how they're good for people, they're good for people. After our conversation yesterday, I had like our own side talk with the team, and I was saying, for underdeveloped countries and developing countries like Nigeria right now, that are still struggling, or maybe the word will not be struggling, or grasping to, some sort of tethers to what their digital framework would look like, now being introduced or being sort of forced to start to look towards AI, right? And also seeing that we still have like a very fragile polity where a lot of things can go wrong at the, just at the flick of the hands. How, because we're just saying, oh, data this, data that. How do you think, we can best position ourselves to be able to create the right frameworks and policies and structures that can help shape what it will look like for us tomorrow? Because I don't think that right now we should be so focused so much on AI. I mean, I like that we should look at it, but we haven't even built the framework on which AI should be running on, right? So what are the things that we need to put in place towards creating that framework where we can now have localized data services, where we can now have local companies who have their services where data can now be stored on, bringing in businesses, but also safeguarding people's private information and content and all that. But I have to fight for the ones who and don't even understand what this thing means for them, right? For a local trader who is out there, or a local business person who's out there putting all their information on TikTok, on Instagram, just because they want to sell. What does this mean for them?
I can take a shot at it. So yeah, you're right that very often when we are hearing conversations about data localization, governments and committees, etc., world over are talking about AI and talking about how localization will boost the AI industry and how it's going to help domestic industry. But really, we don't see very much in terms of a factual demonstration of how that is going to happen. Because, just having your data stored locally within servers in your country does not automatically mean that, you will have more capacity to do AI research, that you will have, that you will have access to this data, that, private industry or that vendor on the street who you want to empower through having this data in your territory, how will that translate into the empowerment of that individual? That link is not very clearly made. And it does seem like, an assertion of sovereignty over the data using tropes like AI, empowerment, economic development, without really demonstrating through facts how, that translation will take place. So I think that is an important barrier to cross. And one of the conversations we've been hearing in the Indian policy context is about creating a regulatory framework around non-personal data. So, we have this whole framework on personal data where you have GDPR, every country is developing its laws on privacy and data protection. But a lot of what feeds into AI is often, anonymized data, which is not individually identifiable. And today, tropes of lots of this data is held by the same companies where countries want to put up, pushback and want to promote domestic industry. There is, say the big tech, or globally, the bigger players, even domestically, the bigger players are the ones who have access to this data. And so there is the need for this conversation about how do you democratize data, irrespective of where it's stored? How do you ensure that more people are able to access, and how I have more autonomy over the data that I generate, right? So conversations about data stewardship, where you can have trusts and models that are created where individuals have a way to control which entities get their data, how their data is used, for what use cases. So to think about those bottom-up kind of models instead of trying to propose localization as a solution, which frankly empowers the state more than it empowers the individuals within that country.
I just pick up on that. Wow, that was brilliant. I loved it. Those were just wonderful, insightful remarks. And let me just echo this and just kind of recapitulate what Smithy just said. One, imagine data that's stored on a server next door versus data that's stored on a server that's accessible, but is stored in the next country, or even in across the sea. As long as the access to the data is very fast, a local company doesn't automatically benefit because the data is stored on a server next door. That's just not the way data works. This is different than ore or other, or even diamonds or other natural resources. It functions differently. So data is non-rivalrous, meaning that many people can use data, and data can be accessed almost instantaneously from across the globe. We are engaged in that data transfer right now across the globe. Smithy's in Rio, I'm in Abu Dhabi, you're in Nigeria, maybe in Lagos, so all this means that we can benefit from our data, our information immediately, and we can all jointly benefit from that data. So I 100% agree that we don't want to recapitulate the colonialism of the last few centuries. Those are appalling times, and we need to have a better view to the future. And now the question is, how do we get there? So I want to be careful that we don't just adopt the same strategies. We don't have the same mindsets. So it almost feels like fighting an old war with old tools. And I think we need to think about, what are the modern tools? What are the ways that we can actually, make benefit of that, use of that data? Look, if I'm thinking about this, and a huge international player is offering cloud services that allow my SME based in Lagos to ramp up and reach across Africa or reach across the world, I'm going to take that opportunity. And I don't care whether that my storefront, my virtual storefront, sits in Singapore or it sits in locally. It doesn't matter to me. So now I do think there are other questions about access to data. So India is asking, for example, well, so I think one of its mindsets is Uber and local competitors like Ola and things like that. We want to make sure that local companies have access to that data. So that's a different question than where the data is stored. And Smithy then says there's actually a key thing where it does matter where the data is stored, because the police can come in and grab the data if it's stored next door, and they're going to have a harder time grabbing it if it's stored in Italy or in Spain or in Singapore. So there, Smithy brings up the civil liberties question very cleverly. And so that tees up a whole other set of issues involved with data localization. Now, if I'm the law enforcement, I definitely want it stored next door. There's no question. It is hard to get data from Italy,
I know,
California, or Singapore. That's really, really hard. So I get that. I totally understand it. And we need better systems to have that data move around for law enforcement purposes. I'm 100% with every law enforcement officer who is irritated by our current systems. That's a whole other question. But for the data as development and avoiding colonialism, I think we need to think about how do we get access to the data? How do we benefit from the data? How do local companies benefit from that data? And then for me, just the kind of abstract, it's stored here and therefore it benefits us. It doesn't actually work. It seems to me not the way data behaves, not the way companies actually use data. So, and I'll stop pontificating after that, but all I was doing there was just recapitulating Smithi's brilliant insights.
Okay, so back to you, Tabure. Tabure, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry. It seems to me you both are less protectionist and more democratic in your thinking. Which is great. Yesterday, I was worried about the idea of completely localizing our data, and I think you've shifted the conversation to access, which is I think the right way to think about it. I have a question. Smriti, you spoke about economic and security justifications for localization of data. Or maybe let's call it access, right? We recently had discussions where agency was, we spoke of agency as a justification. That is myself or a community where communities come together, form unions and demand for ownership of their data. Do you think that is a right tool or not? Or what do you think about that?
So, I would respond to that at two levels. One, in terms of an idea, do I think it's right? I think it's fantastic. I think that's how we need to evolve as, as groups, as communities, as countries, where the individual is more and more empowered. At a practical level, I see that being very, very difficult, certainly in complex societies where, you don't know where the bounds of communities begin and end, like, are all users of Uber and community, or are women who use Ubers between 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. a community, right? This idea of, and Uber is a very elite example, right? There is so many layers of tech services that so many of us use, and it's very, very hard to define who that community would be, and then who will speak for that community. If you want to self-empower that community, how will the structures work? So there is work happening at a research level globally. There's some work happening, interestingly, in India also. But in terms of translating this into practice, I think we are really far from seeing that. And the countries where we are seeing some examples are like, smaller nations, more developed. Sweden, Finland have some examples where they have started creating like, data stewardship models and testing them. But I think in contexts like ours, which are much more complicated, where institutional capacity is more complex, people are not so organized, probably not as aware as we should be. It is much more complex to think about real empowerment at the grassroots.
Yeah. You want to say something, Anupam?
So I think this question about how to, as you described it, not the question of where data is necessarily stored, but who has access to it and who benefits from it. That's really kind of where I'm trying to focus. And for me, a lot of it has to do with what are local companies saying? There's going to be some companies calling for localization, and this is typically going to be telecommunications companies. The big telcos, which often are directly connected to the government, the telcos and the government work hand in hand. They always have, so they're very close. They go back and forth between the two. It used to be a government monopoly. Now they're still, et cetera. So this is the way the world works. And so they're going to be saying localization. But other companies which build a top, the cloud is just a base level infrastructure, and they build atop that. They're offering the value added services. We need to talk to them and really kind of figure out what are their issues. They may not care so they want to make sure that they have strong access to data. They want to make sure that people trust them and there's a legal framework in place where there's a kind of confidence of the consumers and other businesses that makes them a reliable counterparty. But I also think that we need to ask the big platforms, ask the foreign companies that are offering services, ask whether it's financial services or insurance services or cloud services, can you show us what you're doing? Can you show us the metrics that for your success in our country? And let's see how those metrics change over the years. And so I think if I were asked by a government to advise on these things, I would say, and unfortunately, I have I'm good at saying things that governments don't want to hear often. So,
I like that you said this, Chandler.
Yeah,
I like that you said this because I was going to.
Yeah,
I
began by criticizing the TikTok example, right? So you can see that I'm an equal opportunity offender of governments. So if I were advising a government, I would say, hey, look, let's talk to the big players that are there and say, what are you doing for us? Let's publish that. Let's watch that. Let's see what happens next year. Those kinds of metrics are actually useful over time. They may not mean anything in a particular year, but to watch them change is to watch the evolution of that industry and its impact. Sorry.
So I think that is important. No, that's fine. I think that this whole conversation is important, but I like to keep titrating it back down to local, right? Because I have people who are currently in the room who are young people, young technologies, young founders, right, who are asking, how does this concern me, right? And I'm looking at what are the processes for setting up frameworks, right, or for compliance. So now you're saying government should ask these big companies, the big multilaterals, and say, I mean, what are you doing in our country? What's your data practice? What are the metrics? Let's see it, right? So what would that look like? Putting together that process of compliance, of saying, I want to see how you you're collecting data. Where are you storing it? What are you asking? What are you doing? How are you using it? Right? So that, and also how would also companies be held accountable for the data they collect and how they use it, so that even as individuals who are, whether you're just a regular student or you're just a marketer, you have a business, or you're a startup founder, right? You understand how the data that you are generating is being used, and you can decide whether or not you would like to keep doing that or not, right? So that the actions and the lifestyles of people and organizations can now be, sort of, like, say that they would decide, people would know what to do, better. How, if Nigeria decides now, we want to recreate our data protection laws, because we currently have one, right? We currently have some of these structures because we have some of the smartest people in the industry, right, that have been working on these things. But I believe in localizing these laws so that every person in the country can see how they fit into the big picture. So my question, I think, is how can we as a country, and then when I use Nigeria, I'm also referring to underdeveloped and developing countries, put together like compliance frameworks that allow for but content, content developers, content users, data users, data storage facilities and companies to be able to function. And just like you said, share their information and simplify it, because I can share it, but I use a lot of, hocus pocus jargon that you wouldn't understand what it is that I put there, and it wouldn't really make a lot of sense to you. So how do we do that?
Can I? I'm going to respond if it's a great question, and the hocus pocus jargon is something to watch for, right? I don't care how many terabits of information pass and things like that. Those are meaningless numbers. So I want to go back to the way Tobore framed it, which is moving beyond the questions about where data is to who benefits, who has access and who benefits. And so my concern here is not with data privacy or data protection per se. And so our typical national, so I'm not talking about things that don't exist, okay? I'm not actually talking about frameworks that exist now. So this is why governments don't, if what I'm saying, if a government actually asks me what to do, okay, I would say, and by the way, I do speak to a lot of governments and things like that, but it's a separate story about actually listening to what I'm saying. I would say, let's just take TikTok. How many influencers are local? How many people what is the income being earned by people from X country? Okay. And then that may mean nothing this year. Maybe it's $1 million, maybe it's $5 million, but then we can see what happens next year. We can watch it evolve, and we can understand how they describe the benefits to this economy. How many people are on YouTube? What kind of, if there's an app economy, how many app developers are here? So who is getting the benefits of participating in that economy? I'd love to know that data, and we don't have that data. That data just doesn't exist. Now, the companies have it individually. The companies themselves don't disaggregate by country. They don't know that data right now. They don't internally have reason to do this, segregated by country. But I think if a government were clever enough, it could get good data. And that's a separate issue from the privacy frameworks, which Nigeria has been developing. You have a bureau, you're working on this, you're taking that seriously. And of course, Brazil, I think, has been very kind of forward thinking on those questions, where Smriti is on the kind of, data protection from the global South perspective. But I think I would ask for metrics about the benefits that are happening to the country. How many SMEs are getting exposure, buying advertising, seeing their business grow, using these platforms, et cetera, just to single out, say, TikTok or Instagram or whatever. Now, those are, I want to just say, the internet economy is far more than 5 companies. Even if we add TikTok as a 6th or whatever, or Alibaba as a 7th, et cetera, it's far more than 10 companies. And there's just a whole host of players out there. And I would go to all the big players in fintech, in cloud providers, so the handful of major cloud providers, et cetera. And I would try to say, what companies are you working with? Can you show us how many companies are, relying upon your services and benefiting from your services, and seeing how that grows or changes or falls over time. So to try to really get a sense of what is the relationship of the foreign company and the domestic businesses and individuals.
So I'll just add to that. I agree completely that, we have to start with trying to know more. We are everywhere around the world talking about regulating without knowing more about the questions, what and why are we doing this? And I think the kind of information points Anupam talks about, right, that's what we need to begin with. And in terms of, your question around, from the perspective of the small business or the individual, I think the questions which are also important if you think about a regulatory framework is that is there a graded approach in the regulation? So tomorrow, if the regulator says there will be data localization, will there be a carve out for small and medium enterprises? Will there be a carve out for people below a certain threshold and higher obligations for people, with a certain user base, with certain revenue? So I think that's, should the regime go towards localization? I think those are important questions, because this is, of course, a heavy cost for, it's a heavy cost for anyone, but a lot of businesses are in a position to absorb this cost. A lot of them will pass it on to the user. And that's the second, point for the user, how it will impact them, is that if today you're saving your data on any cloud service, which is the cheapest because that's why you go for it, tomorrow, if you're forced to locate within the country in that transition period before that infrastructure scales up in the domestic context, there will be a situation where you will have to opt for the more expensive service provider, maybe the less safe service provider. So, there are all of those trade-offs which will be made in the short to medium term. Maybe you don't have, the tax incentives, the credit incentives, the infrastructure, electricity, all of these other incentives which need to be given to create that domestic data center industry. It's not just about a law to, require you to locate it here. The framework has to also have all these accompanying pros, which will, incentivize both foreign as well as domestic industries to set up data centers. Until we have all of that, and we are in a similar position in India where we have a lot of localization going on, the push for localization going on, but the industry hasn't evolved in terms of data center readiness locally. And so there will be that pain period for small and local businesses, during that transition.
Thank you. I just want to let other attendees know that there's a poll. You can just click on the poll section and complete the poll. That's not for the panelists, for everyone else. Thank you both. I want to ask, Anupam, you mentioned in response to Tracy's question, if I got you right, were you suggesting some form of economic comparison of the impacts of internet companies across borders as a way to measure?
Could you ask that question again? It got cut off a little bit. The internet connection was on my side was a little imperfect.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So are you suggesting some form of economic comparison between countries for internet companies? So to determine the usefulness of that's what you're saying.
Yeah. So what I would say is, look, I would ask each company to make its case for how it's benefiting your economy, and providing metrics in every case. And imagine doing that if you had 100 countries that are requesting this, and now each country can compare what is being told by those companies, okay, and hold them as like, oh wait, we're getting this and they're getting that. Wait, what's the difference?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot, so my frustration is, look, I came at this whole thing from the economic development perspective. Mm-hmm. So my roots are deep in economic development. I studied with Amartya Sen. My first goal is how do we lift people out of poverty? That's the critical thing. Okay, so I want to make sure that we do it consistent with civil liberties and all those things. But let's figure out how we do that. A lot of American scholarship is focused mostly on the civil liberties side, and the focal point then of the regulation is how do we get civil liberties in the infrastructure? Okay, but my questions are actually about how I want to make sure that people are actually being uplifted economically, so they can then, for the most important things, take care of themselves, right? And so that is a different set of questions, and it's not questions that are often asked in American legal scholarship. So you have to be cautious of, as someone in the global South, of adopting the American legal scholars' focal focus, because their focus is not this. They don't have the same bread and butter issues, I mean, life and death issues that are faced across the developing world. It's just a different set of concerns. So look, I write a ton about privacy law. I write a lot about European Union and American privacy law. Those are central questions and central fundamental issues for me. But I'm also, if I'm advising a global South country, I'm like, the first and most important thing is, how are you making my people better off? And it's a different set of questions than we hear in the West.
So I have a follow-up question. So we live in a competitive world. If internet companies were publishing how effective they've been to this economy and that, what impact does that have on national competitiveness?
So first of all, let me just tell you, this is going to be what I'm asking is a very painful exercise, because it's an exercise that's bound to embarrass them, right? They're going to say, oh my God, we're doing nothing. We have no people. We're not benefiting much in this country. And now the comparison, it's very like, our platform is very unequal in different ways. But that itself might galvanize them to ensure a better result. So I don't think a bad grade 1 year in one country is necessarily the key thing, because we're taking a snapshot. My goal is long-term, how are these things changing over time? And how many students are they training in these things? There's just so many different ways that we want technology transfer to occur, et cetera. There's just, and every company is different. So that's why I'm saying, let them make the case. It's not even that the country government would say, these are the questions that we have for you. Exactly. It would be letting them make their case with metrics, and then going back to them and saying, well, this is insufficient detail. We want more detail about this. That's what I would do if I were if I were the digital minister of one of these countries.
Yes.
Okay.
Let me just add something before you.
Okay. Okay.
We have a major role in terms of educating our policymakers and our lawmakers. I saw what happened in the US with the lawmakers when they were, with the session with the TikTok CEO. They were ill-informed, and here in Nigeria, it's worse. You can't even
they asked him if TikTok used Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
If TikTok accessed the Wi-Fi. And he was like, what? Does TikTok access what? It's like, yes, if you turn on the Wi-Fi, we use the Wi-Fi.
Yeah. So this sort of oversight will require us to educate our lawmakers, and our policymakers to the point where they can, oversee these big tech companies. Over to you, Tracy.
I mean, I'm for the small guy right here, right? All these conversations we're having, it's a bit elitist because, we're having government officials have conversations with big corporations and everybody's saying, oh, let's see what you're doing. I'm still here, I'm the one down here saying, hi, we the small guys, we're right here. And I'm going to make this question to you, Smriti, before you, Chanda, you come on board, right? I'm going to use Nigeria as an example. Right now, we just came out from a very heated election process where there was a lot of bigotry, ethnic rivalry. I was scared. I started to look for my passport, to dust it up, and to just get ready to just move if it really came to that. But, it sort of showed me how easy things could degenerate very fast. And I'm still saying that, how do we how do we educate our policymakers to maybe promote the development of technological solutions, maybe like encryption, things like anonymization? I mean, I think they're doing it, but how do we make it more? Because, for example, And I'm going to go back to, what we're doing with AI. So you have access to all this information and data out there, and it can be used for evil. As much as we want to say, yes, access to data makes for economic prosperity and everything, and everybody's fine and we're happy birthday. Fantastic. What of the other side of it? Now there's access to information, and this company is going to be used to maybe sort of drive some wrong conversation that actually now sets the polity of fire, right? And using Nigeria as a country, we saw a conversation between two large ethnic groups in Nigeria that nearly turned into something very nasty. Imagine now that we're in this scenario where information or data can be distorted and made to look like reality, right? And it turns into something that nobody ever looked at, just because we're saying we're not necessarily all about localization. We just want to give access and let's know what you're doing. But then we have a country that we don't even have the process that helps us as we currently are, right? Because the countries you're mentioning, they have processes, human rights, their police system is working, their justice system is working. They have all sorts of remedies that can be used or can be leveraged upon should there be these issues. But then back home, we don't have these structures to work for us on our local conversations. What would happen? What should we do? But, just paint a picture of what would happen if these things are not put in place. And then what should be a way forward for how we can help handhold our policymakers to create these solutions, or to create possible solutions that would be obviously leverage technology, right, to help us with safeguarding data, just so that things like this don't happen.
Thank you so much for that. You framed that question so excellently, and it's the perfect segue to something I wanted to add to what Anupam was saying, and you really set the context to it, which is the question around, this development versus civil liberties question, I think is all the more important in the developing country context. The emphasis on civil liberty is all the more important, not to take away from the importance of development, but given that we are in a context where we don't have the institution, we often don't have the state capacity, we see technology being replaced as a solution for, you have corruption, use technology. You have targeting issues, use technology. You have these age-old problems that communities are fighting with each other. Let's have a layer of technology to somehow solve it, right? And through all of this, you're creating a whole new set of problems, a whole new set of power equations and relations are being created. And that is what we are not talking about. We're talking about, okay, there are these platforms. So, suppose there is a election campaign going on and two communities end up fighting, and that fight results from communication that takes place on social media. What is the underlying problem is that we have social structures where communities want to fight over false news. The problem is not solely that you have a social media platform where this news can go viral. Of course, that's something that, perpetuates the problem, but that's not where all your intervention should be. So the state's interest there is, to the contrary about, you were asking about how do we enhance encryption? Actually, the state's interest is how do you break encryption? Because the more and more information is encrypted, they are not able to see us as individuals. They are not able to, regulate what we are doing, and the state is very much aligned with businesses in terms of wanting to see you more and more, not for profiling and targeting, but for doing law enforcement or for all the other reasons that the state does. Of course, I make it sound like the state is just this very evil entity. It does some good also, but it wants to see you, right? And so therefore it wants
most
to push
most times it is an evil entity.
Yeah, and so therefore I would say this question about civil liberties, of how data localization can directly or indirectly interfere in free speech, because platforms are going to be all the more amenable to listening to what the state has to say when there is that lever of the data being stored locally and the ability to shut down data centers and use brute force, which is possible in these kind of scenarios. The fact that we have, I don't know if that's the case in Nigeria, but at least in India, we have the ability for law enforcement to access data without judicial consent, just through executive sanctions. Data can be accessed, personal data of individuals, which is crazy. I know I can see in your face that's crazy, but that's where we are at right now.
Because where do you draw that line? If they can, use brute force to be able to access data without judicial, then also when government wants to have their way, they can do that. This is the sort of the quandary where we're at. This is the circle where we're at. And Chanda, what do you think?
Those are, look, incredibly important point. And, you know, the idea that you were dusting off your passport after the last election is scary, right? And your point that things can go south much faster than you could ever think is really bracing. And it should be, you know, it's something that, you know, many of us, we take the kind of governance institutions for granted. We don't worry that, you know, whatever the change of government will occur in 2024, we talk about moving to Canada, but no one ever really means it in the United States. You know, so I don't know if one person has, you know, has actually picked up ever, despite saying if so-and-so wins, I'm moving to Canada, you know. So, but those are much more serious questions in kind of in democracies and, you know, in kind of fledgling states that have more precarious positions, that don't have as deep institutions as we're privileged to have in the United States, at least thus far. I mean, things can go south in the United States as well. And I agree with Smriti that the questions in that context, then civil liberties is, I didn't mean, by the way, to say civil liberties is less important. I just wanted to say that we didn't want to, the American framing of the legal issues is a narrow one, focused on issues that concern us. And you want to be cautious about not, there's a much broader set of questions that the global South countries have to examine. And so not everything is just about data privacy and we've settled everything. There's just a whole other set of issues. So that's what I want to say. And so Smriti is exactly right that, you know, issues like data localization may give greater power to the local state and raise other kinds of questions that I think you know, are really difficult ones that I think need to be addressed as well. So.
Okay, so this is my final question. But before we go to the questions, I'd like to still remind the attendees that we have the poll still going on. Kindly help us, you know, attend to the polls and answer these questions. So now we've identified that these are key questions that we need to be asking. And as an organization, right, that is very focused on helping policymakers to understand the ramification of some of these decisions that they had to make, because they sit out there and they make and pass these legislations and laws that will affect the ordinary person on the street. And so we're helping them to understand that, you know, these are not just numbers, these are not just words on a paper, these are people, right? So when you make these laws, you are going to be changing somebody's life out there. So it's be careful not to, you know, change it for the worse, right? So how would countries, because I mean, countries typically come together to have all these conversations on how they can have like a ratification on what's the global best practice on what to do, right? I know I've tried to do a demarcation of developing and underdeveloping, but is there sort of like a standard, right, that countries can come to an agreement and say, regardless of whether you're a big pharma in this context, you're a big data organization, or whether you're small, as long as you're handling data, cross-border data, these are the questions that you need to answer. These are the details that you need to provide, just like, you know, Chanda was saying, these are the information you need to share. These are the questions you need to ask people who use your platform. These are the things that you need to do, just so that across board, right, even companies, you know, private organizations, public institutions, even the government will be held accountable, and people will understand that they have a priority to themselves to ask these questions, right, and answer these questions in such a way that, you know, because if I do know that these are the things that are being expected of a company, and so before I use like a TikTok, right, I now know that I have to make sure that these things are, for example, before I would typically just buy a phone, and just go ahead and log in and use it. I never used to go through the fine print. Now I will spend 2 days. I want to know, what am I signing up for? Can they wake up in the morning and just take everything and just be like, bye-bye? And then I have all my pictures gone, and stuff like that. So is there a possibility that we can have that central framework that that a lot of countries will be, held by? That's my last question.
I think Anupam first because he needs to leave. So Anupam, why don't you go first?
So yeah, apologies for having to leave, but great question. I think right now we're still working on these frameworks. You've got a number of entities from the UN to the OECD, and then efforts by the biggest countries like Brazil, like India even. I'm not saying India is perfect, Brazil is not perfect, all these, but there are some kind of emerging things that one can learn. India is relatively advanced on issues like building a digital identity system, which the questions about whether or not there are enough privacy framework sufficient to protect it, but so I think right now the one thing Deborah also began by saying, asked about AI at the start. I want to say that and saying countries like Nigeria are trying to figure this out. America is trying to figure it out. European Union is trying to figure it out. No one has gotten it right. Okay, so Tamara already mentioned the U.S. Congress. You saw them, and you didn't come away that impressed, right? So look, there were some Congress members who were actually really smart, there were some computer engineers in there. So there were some people who knew what they're talking about, but it was a tiny fraction of all those who spoke. I listened to all 5 hours, by the way. So you should not feel, like you guys are the only ones dealing with legislators who don't know enough about technology. This is a universal problem. We face it in the United States as well, which may come, which after the hearings may not come as much as a surprise, but maybe a surprise to others who think that it gets, understands the internet, and technology, and its government is really totally, on top of all these things. So I think right now, you guys will have to help build those best practices. So you can't just look outside. You guys have to, we're depending upon you to lead as well. And so you are some of the world's leaders on these questions, and we'll be coming to you and learning from you. So I have to go, but thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
It's lovely talking to you, all of you.
Thank you so much, Chanda. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
So I'll
okay,
just,
so
yeah. Sorry, do you want to go first, Deborah?
No.
No,
Okay.
Bashira, continue.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I just wanted to say, to answer your question in terms of thinking about global compacts or global level obligations, I do think we need to break that down into specific fields. I don't think there will be one answer. So there are conversations happening, say, in the domain of e-commerce, right, where the G20 countries or a majority of the G20 countries are thinking about data free flow with trust. What is happening? The Osaka track of discussion. There's something happening there. About 85 countries have come together as a subset of WTO countries and are talking about free flows in the context of e-commerce. And I know India is not aligned with that. I know large part of Africa is not aligned with them because the position there has been that we're still figuring out our domestic policies and we don't want to tie our hands into an international agreement, which basically freezes this current status quo of free flow with trust, but that is in favor of certain countries which already have the advantage of having those institutions, systems, companies, which are leading that data flow. So then if you freeze it today saying everybody will allow free data flows, that is, not for the universal advantage of countries. There are that the economic disadvantages which are perpetuating will be further perpetuated. So there is, some ground to the resistance we are seeing there, because while I am against too much protectionism at the domestic level, I'm also against tying your hands at the international level. And we need to, as countries, find that balance. And the third dimension of international conversations is around data flow for the purpose of law enforcement. And there again, there are some conventions like the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which has certain provisions, but that's again not, it's a Europe-centric convention. There are other countries which are party to it, but it's not a global convention yet. But forums like those, if they can be broad-based, might be a solution for at least the law enforcement part of it, which is, one of the justification often used for data localization.
Beautiful. I think at this point we'll end this session.
I think someone wants to speak.
Someone wants to speak, or someone has a question or something. Yeah, I just forgot to ask Q&A. But from what you said, Smriti, the last thing you just said was very powerful. There's no universal. Yeah, there's no universal. I think that is the number one thing I have learned over the past 2 days. Yeah, there's no one solution.
There's no one size that fits all. Yes. Okay, so Munir Umar Sani I think he wants to ask a question. I can let him ask a question, but let's be quick so that we can let. Oh wow, I think he dropped off. Okay.
Okay.
I think that's that. Thank you so much, Bashira. Thank you. I feel like I can now go and write my op-ed on, data protection, civil liberties, or development, which one to go, because I feel like I've learned a lot more and I like the way you broke it down, and you and Chanda brought it home so that I was able to, so that I don't leave here and they ask me like, what's happened? I'm just like, I don't know. It was very interesting. It was very down to earth, but it was still as cerebral and fully packed. And I'm grateful for that. Thank you so much. Thank
you so much.
Thank you for your time. We'll be in touch.
Thank you for having me. This was a fantastic discussion. Thank you both. Excellent moderation, excellent contributions. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Bashir. Bye-bye.